first of all, who is Ron Paul? Well, at the time of filming this, Ron Paul is still alive, so we're not going to talk about it as many of our historical people talk about, like, he was this, he is this. As much as possible, I'll try and say he is this, and this is something which happened in the past tense, whatever. So, what are some of the things which influenced Ron Paul? Well, it's primarily the idea of libertarianism. Now, when I started the channel a long time ago, it feels like, right? I spoke about the history of libertarianism, so I definitely would recommend watching that so you have a bit more understanding. The quality is not as good, I think it's before the green screen, but still watch it and you'll learn quite a lot from it, right? So within American context, what libertarianism tends to be is this idea of minimalist government, right? So, the government should focus on defense and it should focus on law and order, maybe roads and other little things like that. But other than that, you're on your own and stuff, and like the government shouldn't get involved. There's no welfare state, etc., etc. And obviously, like, depending on how far along the libertarian spectrum you are, some people have a thing where they want more intervention within like the government for these kind of welfare programs, and other people say that they want much less. But still, this is one of the overarching views for libertarians, right? On top of that as well, there's this idea of non-interventionism, right? So the idea of the so-called non-aggression principle, which is basically a kind of like universal one, which is this: if someone is not harming someone else, leave them alone. So if you decide to like do something, right, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else, as long as there's no victim to what you're doing, leave them alone, right? And this general kind of like non-interventionism doesn't just apply to like the economy, where it's like, well, okay, don't intervene when there's a recession, etc., etc., but also as well when there's like, like for instance, like if people decide that they want to take drugs or something, it's like, no, the state, it's not the state's role to kind of intervene in that and to say what people can do with their own bodies. And then on a wider level, when it talks about international politics and stuff, right, it's basically kind of saying like, unless your country's attacked or you feel like it's under threat of being attacked, stay out of foreign conflicts. So don't, as one of the founding fathers said, don't go out for monsters to seek to destroy yourself, right? That's kind of the general idea. So non-interventionism, both on a domestic level and on a kind of like international level, right? And on top of that, within the domestic policy of America, it's this idea of, having a strict constitution, right? So rather than kind of reading things into the constitution and being like, okay, right, so this clause here, we could kind of interpret it in modern eyes as it could mean this, right? Instead, it means having a very strict kind of like view of it and basically being like, what would the founding fathers have done in this situation, right? When they wrote this, what was their intentions, right? And having a very strict view on that. So the founding fathers obviously wanted a limited government. So those who believe in a kind of like strict constitutionalist role, they very much view it as like, okay, founding fathers wanted a limited government. This expands the role of government, therefore it's unconstitutional, right? So now that you have that kind of overarching framework of ideas, now you can understand who Ron Paul is and kind of what are the things that basically drive him, right? So who is Ron Paul? Well, he was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1935, and he later became a doctor. So while he was on national service, like he ended up being a flight surgeon with the US Air Force from 1963 until 1965. And then later on, he ended up joining the US Air National Guard. Didn't know that National Guard had an air wing to it. But anyway, he was in that from 1965 to 1968. And then upon returning from his national service, he relocated his family to Texas, and that's where he has stayed ever since, right? So during this time when he's trained to be a doctor, right, he's reading different political books, right? And one of the books which really influences him is this one we have here, which is Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, right? So he wrote this in 1943, and this is really influential both for him and for me and for many other people, because what this is basically talking about was this idea of, it was obviously written in the middle of World War II, and what Hayek could see at this time was that whereas before World War II, the role of the government was very small in people's lives, right? During World War II, because of the war effort, and don't forget that Hayek, he was an Austrian who'd moved to London to escape the Nazis and stuff, right? So he'd seen the society there change and become a lot more statist, where the central government taking more and more control over people's lives on like a day-to-day level. And what he worried was that as a result of the war, right, even in the peacetime, people would still continue to have this kind of like collectivist like status kind of like way of like running the economy and running society in general, right? So this is one of the things that he warned against, right? So reading Hayek, he was influenced by that, and he was influenced by some other libertarian thinkers as well, in particular von Mises, who is an economist, as well as the philosopher Ayn Rand, and on top of that, he also had like a personal relationship with Murray Rothbard, right? So all of these kind of libertarian thinkers are, I don't know how to put this, they're further along the kind of libertarian spectrum as such, yeah, than someone like Milton Friedman would be. So Milton Friedman is like, he obviously wanted a kind of a libertarian society as well, but he understood that there was more of a role for a welfare state, and there was, in some limited regards, there was, in just in a practical sense, yeah, like there would have to be some sort of government intervention within certain regards, right? So Ron Paul is more that way thinking and further away from like what Milton Friedman was kind of thinking, right? Now, one of the things that really animated Ron Paul and got him wanting to be involved in politics was in 1971, Richard Nixon took America off the gold standard. Now, we've discussed this in our last video, yeah, where we're talking about William Jennings Bryan, so definitely check that out for a more in-depth kind of look at like, gold standard and bimetallism and all that kind of stuff, right? So what Richard Nixon did is in 1971, he took America off the gold standard, but he didn't put it back onto kind of bimetallism as had been in like more prior times. Instead, what he did is he just was like, right, the currency, the dollar, is just going to be free floating, right? So all the different like currencies in the world can just be like openly trade with each other, and the value of the dollar, the value of the pound, the value of all these different things are just going to be based on other economic factors, yeah, which are going to influence it, right? So this is something which Ron Paul was very much opposed to, because this is so-called fiat currency, right? This is where the currency is not based on anything, and as a result, you end up having a lot of inflation, a lot of like price instability, like in the preceding decade and stuff. So this is one of the things which Ron Paul was very much opposed to, and he decided at this point that he was going to enter a congressional politics, and he wanted to get all this changed. So in 1974, in the 22nd Congressional District in Texas, he tries to run to become a congressman there. He fails the first time. Then later on in the spring of 1976, there ends up being a so-called special election, which in the UK we'd call a by-election, right? And he ends up winning it there. However, in November of the same year, he ended up getting kicked out again. But then in 1978, he finally gets elected, and he is re-elected in 1980 and in 1982. Now, during all these times when he was elected and he was getting re-elected, it was said to really help the fact of he was one of only 2 obstetricians in the whole of that county. And so as a result, he ended up being very popular amongst a lot of the young mothers in that district, right? So half of the babies are getting born by him, and the other half are being born by his other obstetrician friend, right? So as a result, that kind of like helped him in his favor, right? So at the end of this first time that he's in Congress, right, he tries to run for one of the Senate seats in Texas. He ends up losing in that one, but then he kind of just goes off and gets involved in like other things, other political organizations outside of like Congress, right? So upon leaving the Congress, he ends up becoming a founder for the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education. That took me 3 times to say. I don't know why. But anyway, so yes, the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education. And he also becomes the first chairman of the Citizens for a Sound Economy. So this is the CSE, right? So this latter one is funded by the Koch brothers. This is Charles Koch, and I can't remember what the other one is called, right? But these are the Koch brothers. These are some libertarian billionaires who like put a lot of money into different organizations and stuff, and to try and promote libertarian values. So this ended up splitting off at a later point. One of them became Freedom Works, and the other one became Americans for Prosperity. And these 2 organizations end up becoming a foundational block for what later would become the Tea Party, right? So around 2008, 2009, you have the Tea Party movement, which is very much in favor of having a smaller government, and especially having like less taxation for the people. So this is one of the kind of movements, and he's kind of in the forefront of this, right? And this is where he ends up building a lot of his political credentials. Now, upon leaving Congress and failing to get the Senate seat for Texas, what he ends up doing is he basically becomes very disillusioned with the Republican Party. And as a result of this, he ends up switching more towards the Libertarian Party, right? Because they kind of speak to him more. And one of the reasons why he became disillusioned with Republicans is President Reagan talked a very big game about, balanced budgets and all these kind of things of fiscal responsibility. And yet, when he was in office, right, he ended up resulting in one of the largest deficits. I think at that time it was the largest deficit in peacetime that had ever been achieved by any kind of government, or achieved a bad use of a word, but you see what I'm saying. So he was kind of like, well, there's an inconsistency here, yeah, right? You say that you're in favor of small government and on balanced budgets, and yet the state is growing, and the deficit is growing, etc., etc. And so he ended up switching to the Libertarian Party, and he actually ended up running on the Libertarian Party ticket in the 1988 presidential election. Now, he didn't do too well. He only won 0.5% of the popular vote in that election. But the thing with Ron Paul to note is that for him, it's not so much about him getting into office. He wants to basically use the platform of him running as a way of spreading the ideas of libertarianism, right? And one of the things that you can see is in this TV show, the so-called Morton Downey Jr. show. So, this show, I'll put a link in the description of it, and I'll show you a little bit of a clip now, just so you can understand, so what Ron Paul is arguing for in this take here is for the legalization of drugs, right? Because as I said before, this is kind of a standard libertarian thing. The government shouldn't have any control over what you do with your own body. And so that's kind of like the stance that he was taking. But this was during the era of the so-called war on drugs. This is where it's really hyped up to some insane levels. This is where it's kind of, just say no. And so the crowd here are, and the host as well, this is probably the worst kind of reception I've ever seen for any politician ever, right? Here's a clip of it now.
Was almost killed because of your type of demented thinking.
No, because I defend the Constitution.
How can I take anyone seriously who looks like... How serious your war on drugs is. The guy looks like he just came from Emmett Kelly's funeral.
You're avoiding the issue when you attack its clothes. Stick to the issue. Right. The issues are drugs and freedom.
I'll stick to the issues, pal. If I had a slime like you in the White House, I'd puke on you.
Yeah, see, that was not very nice, was it? And on top of that, it's interesting to note that Morton Downey Jr. Within that show at one point, Ron Paul kind of says, well, you're smoking the cigarettes and stuff, right? It's your, the government shouldn't tell you what to do. It's your personal responsibility. It's your life. It's your body. You should do what you want. And Morton Downey Jr. says, no, well, the government should pass a law, and then I'd quit straight away if they did. The thing is, he later ended up dying of lung cancer. Yeah, so it's a little bit of irony that this is the kind of point that Ron Paul was saying. Yeah, it's about people taking personal responsibility. So if you choose to take drugs, if you choose to take alcohol, if you choose to smoke cigarettes, it's your responsibility. It's your life. It shouldn't be for the government to come in and say you ought to do this because it will make you feel better, right? And it will make you healthier. That's not what the role of government ought to be, according to kind of libertarians, right? So anyway, so obviously he doesn't end up becoming the president in 1988, surprise, surprise. But then a few years later, he ends up returning to Congress, this time for the 14th district of Texas. And this is where he's the congressman from 1997 up until 2013, right? So during the kind of total 22 years of him being in office, right, you'd expect him to have been a very successful kind of person and stuff, right? Not necessarily. The thing is, it's with Ron Paul, you have to kind of see him almost like a kind of John the Baptist kind of character, right? In the sense of he's kind of this lone voice in the wilderness, right? As a matter of fact, he ended up having the nickname, which was Dr. No. A, because obviously he's a doctor, but B, because he said no to every single law which came through, which he deemed as being unconstitutional, right? Which, as we've discussed earlier with regard to this kind of strict interpretation of what the founding fathers wanted, there's a lot of policies which the founding fathers would not have wanted, right? And so he basically voted against nearly every single bit of legislation which came through the Congress during this time. So of all the different proposals which he did, yeah, right. So all the kind of like bills that he sponsored, right? There were 620 of them. Guess how many of them actually end up being passed? One. And it's quite an insignificant one. It's so insignificant I can't even remember it. It's on screen now, but just yeah, it's not really, yeah. But like, so this means that he had a success rate in Congress of like 0.1 or whatever it is, right? It's absolutely tiny, right? But again, the point is, he wants to be that lone voice in the wilderness, right? He wants to be talking about these ideas. He wants to be promoting these ideas, right? He wants to be, if there's only one person in a whole of Congress or whatever who's promoting libertarian ideas, he'd rather be that one person than kind of have all the kind of pomp and circumstance that comes with high office. Now, during the Clinton administration, you end up obviously having the Lewinsky Gate scandal. So, like, obviously, we all know about Monica Lewinsky. Like, even people born after that, So, he was one of the Republicans in Congress who pushed for his impeachment because, like, the president lied, like to the public, being like,
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
So he tried to impeach Clinton for that. But also, what he tried to impeach him for was with regard to his intervention in terms of like foreign policy, right? So, as we kind of have said before, in terms of like libertarians in general tend to be against foreign intervention, and especially within the sense of like being a strict constitutionalist. Yeah, the U.S. Constitution says that the United States can only go to war if Congress declares war on places, right? So the president is the commander in chief, but the president can't just be like, we want to go to war with these people, we want to attack these people, etc., etc. It has to be a thing where the Congress has to pass it and say, right, we're going to war, and then the president becomes the commander in chief. Whereas over like the last like 70 or 80 years since World War II, there hasn't been any declarations of war, and so U.S. presidents have kind of like just done things, yeah, and the Congress has kind of like given them like tacit support and stuff, but there's not actually been like a formal process, right? And therefore, in Ron Paul's eyes, all the interventions that have taken place like since World War II have been illegitimate. So the Clinton administration in 1998 did two things. First of all, they bombed Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1998, and this is to do with the no-fly zone, which is a hangover from like the Gulf War. So like American planes were keeping no-fly zones, so that Saddam's forces couldn't bomb the Kurds and couldn't bomb the Shias and all that kind of stuff, right? And on top of that as well, in 1998, you had Al Qaeda doing their attacks on I want to say the USS Cole. I think I've got the right name, right? And then also the embassy buildings in East Africa, so in Kenya and in Tanzania. So they end up doing a lot of terrorist attacks in that kind of like region of the world, right? And so the response of the Clinton administration was to bomb targets, Al Qaeda bases in Sudan and in Afghanistan. So this is kind of, in a way, the prelude to like the war on terror. So many people don't know about the ins and outs of the war on terror, kind of just look at 9/11 and just kind of, they focus just on that. They don't recognize that like, throughout that decade beforehand, Al Qaeda had been doing different terrorist attacks kind of like on the United States, most particularly of course with like the World Trade Center one in 1993. But anyway, so the reason I'm telling you this is because it sets the stage. This is when he kind of gets his credentials for being anti-war and for being like non-interventionist, right? So in 2008, he ends up running for the Republican primaries, and he doesn't do so well. He gets 5.6% of the vote within that convention, right? However, moving forward, he ends up running, of course, in 2012, and this is when he became like very famous, right? And this is when I started to like be of an age where I was really in-depthly following politics. The 2012 like kind of US election, starting with Republican primaries and obviously finishing with the presidential election. This was the first political event that I followed like from the start to the finish, right? Because obviously at that age I was like 17 going on 18, and so as a result of that I like really like followed this like in depth and stuff, and I was very much like because at that time I was really kind of a classical liberal, because I've read like Thomas Paine and all this kind of stuff. And so during this time when I was looking at the different candidates for like who I wanted to win the Republican Party, Ron Paul really stood out to me, right? And during this time actually I bought his book, the Revolution and Manifesto. So this was written in 2008, but like it became really popular around 2011, 2012, right? So I was really in favor of Ron Paul winning that. However, he only ended up getting 11% of the primary votes, right? So Ron Paul, he didn't win. He didn't even come close to winning. But it's something to note that within the Tea Party, as we mentioned, right, he was very, very popular within that. And also, as well, when we're talking about US veterans, although up on the stage, and obviously you can still see like clips of these debates and stuff, you still see the whole thing like on YouTube and stuff, right? But within these debates, all the other people on the stage there were talking about how America needs to like intervene in this place, and America needs to be strong and this and that, and have bases and troops and stuff all over the world. And Ron Paul is the one person on that stage who's saying, no, we should pull out of all these places, pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of Iraq, pull out of all these places, yeah. Stop having an American empire. Let's just focus in on ourselves, yeah. Let's focus on like sorting out our own mess, yeah, rather than trying to be the policeman of the world, right? And obviously he ended up getting boos from a lot of people in the crowd. But at the same time, he also ended up having a lot of support from veterans who had served in many of these wars and who also had the view of like, what were we fighting for? What was the point in us getting involved in all these kind of places? So he did have some basis, yeah. He did have some level of support. And actually, when you do like head-to-heads of like Ron Paul versus Obama, in some polls, although obviously in the majority of polls, Obama ends up like beating him and stuff, yeah. But there are some polls that show that if it had gone to a head-to-head, there's a chance of Ron Paul beating Obama, because Obama was very much an interventionist. He said he would end all these wars, but actually he just ended up increasing them. The US, at the beginning of his presidency, was involved militarily in 2 conflicts. By the end of his presidency, he was involved in 7 different conflicts, right? And so many of the people would have been more kind of like swayed towards voting for Ron Paul if you're of this kind of like non-interventionist thing, in particular amongst young people. So there's an element to which this potentially could have happened. But now that we've kind of laid the kind of groundwork for this, right? This is where we're going to get into the kind of what if, right? So what if Ron Paul had won the presidency in 2012? As unlikely as that is, as just like it would never have happened, it's just obvious why it would never have happened, right? We're going to look into what would have happened if he had become the president.